All right, this is a recording of the reading for Chapter 27, Section 5. Challenge and Change in the 1950s. First of all, let's go over the title, Challenge and Change in the 1950s. So things that were going to be different and also the things that were not easy to deal with. You can see already from the first vocab, nuclear war, war that uses atomic weapons. So we have, remember the dropping of the first atomic bombs during World War II, and so now we have a competition between the Soviet Union and the United States to create more, bigger, and better atomic weapons. Let's go on to any other questions that usually Calvin would ask. What was McCarthyism? So I explained to you that Joseph McCarthy was a senator from actually Appleton, Wisconsin. He's going to go on a witch hunt for communists in our government. And he used that was his claim to fame. Accusation, a charge of wrongdoing. Reputation, how a person is judged by others. McCarthyism, an attempt to gain power by attacking the patriotism of others. Another question, how did the civil rights movement begin? Civil rights are basic rights that people have, like think of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So every person, regardless of skin color or race or background or previous condition of servitude, should have equal rights, such as voting. So we're going to see, looking at you might have heard of Rosa Parks, that's her there. Credit cards. National Guard, that's a state's military force. You might recognize that man, Martin Luther King Jr. Look at his speech. Automation, the use of machines to do work. Television debuted and became popular in the 1950s. How was Eisenhower reelected? Remember, Eisenhower was the commander for D-Day and of the Allied forces during World War II, so he becomes president. Space race. Artificial satellite is one of our words, an object made by humans that travels in outer space and sends signals back to Earth. And then the review. Like, do you think you would have liked living in the 1950s? Why or why not? How did Americans prepare for a nuclear war? What was McCarthyism? How did Rosa Parks help begin the civil rights movement? How did roads improve in the 1950s? How did the Russians start the space race? All right, giddy up, let's go. The Republicans argued that the Democratic Party had become filled with corruption. They claimed that the Truman administration had handled the Korean War badly. It is time for a change, the Republicans said. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Republican candidate, was elected president in 1952. He won in a landslide victory over Adlai Stevenson. Landslide victory means he won by a long shot. Known as Ike, Eisenhower was a hero of World War II. He took office in 1953 and became a popular president. The nation's economy was doing well during most of the years Eisenhower held office. Soldiers who had returned from fighting in World War II and Korea had started families. New home construction soared, as did the need for more and better American products. During this time, the lives of most Americans improved. I told you about how when we have an increase in population, that the economy does well, and that's exactly what's happening after World War II in the 1950s. The fear of communism in the Soviet Union still existed. The Soviet Union developed an atomic bomb. Americans were worried about a war using atomic weapons or a nuclear war. People built bomb shelters in their backyards. Cities set up air raid warning signals. School children were taught to get under their desks or go to a certain place quickly when they heard air raid sirens. It says in this picture, this family model bomb shelter shows an escape opening at the top and an entrance that attached to a cellar. This kind of shelter was placed underground. So you could buy these and have them installed, and really all it did was help the companies that made them. What was McCarthyism? In 1947, President Truman and other political leaders feared that communists were working within the United States government. Truman issued an order creating a loyalty security program for federal employees. During the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, nearly 7,000 federal workers suspected of being security risks were either fired or forced to resign. Americans feared communism, and Senator Joseph McCarthy used his fear for his own political gain. He kept saying that traitors were trying to destroy the country. McCarthy became one of the most feared members of the Senate. Many American educators, journalists, and entertainers lost their jobs as a result of his accusations. Others had their reputations ruined. For a long time, few politicians were willing to challenge McCarthy. McCarthy began to investigate Army officials. The Senate held televised hearings for 36 days in 1954. When television audiences saw McCarthy as a lying bully, they demanded an investigation. A special Senate committee found that most of McCarthy's charges were untrue. With the help of television, the American people were able to take away much of McCarthy's power. The campaign he had used to make his accusations soon became known as McCarthyism. How did the civil rights movement begin? African Americans had fought for democracy in 2 world wars. Yet when they returned from these wars, they were still denied basic political and social rights. In the 1950s, many African Americans decided that the members of their race could no longer be victims. The civil rights movement was sparked by a 1954 decision of the Supreme Court, Brown v. the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. When you see that in italic font and you see the V, that means it's a Supreme Court case. A young African American girl was denied the right to attend a white school. Her father sued the school board. NAACP, or we say NAACP, lawyers, including Thurgood Marshall, worked very hard on this case. And NAACP, by the way, is not in here, but it stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Marshall later became the first African Americans appointed to the Supreme Court. In the decision, the Supreme Court ruled that separate schools for whites and African Americans were unconstitutional. In 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote that separate can never be equal. Local school boards were ordered to end school segregation. So when we talked about Jim Crow laws and people using separate drinking fountains, that was okay for a long time until this major Supreme Court case said that you can no longer separate people based on race. And this started with schools, okay? In December 1955, Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old African American, got on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She found a seat near the middle of the bus. The bus driver asked Parks to give up her seat to a white person. Parks would not. Police were called and she was arrested. Parks had not planned to challenge the law on that day. Parks said, "I felt it was just something that I had to do." Her decision not to move from her seat on a bus was the quiet beginning of a national civil rights movement. All right, we'll read quick about credit cards. The advent of credit cards. Credit allows a person to make purchases without cash. In America, credit plans grew quickly between 1850 and 1900. The plans allowed buyers to pay for purchases over time. Modern credit cards began with the formation of Diners Club in 1950. Cardholders used the same card to buy from many merchants. In 1951, Franklin National Bank of New York was the first bank to offer a card. By 1958, several other companies offered cards. In the 1980s, credit card companies had huge growth. Now, nearly every American family has at least one major credit card. They use a card to buy groceries, vacations, and more. All right, going on. Again, National Guard, that's a state's military force. Going on with the Civil Rights Movement, a 26-year-old minister named Martin Luther King Jr. led a boycott of the buses in Montgomery in 1956. What is a boycott? Boycott is when you refuse to pay for something or refuse to buy something. So they're not going to pay or use the buses. He helped to organize carpools to help African Americans travel around the city. He was arrested for his actions. 1 year later, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public transportation was unconstitutional. So that meant, through those efforts, that they could not make people sit in different sections of the bus. That's what segregation is, separating by race. King went on to become the most visible person in the civil rights movement. He urged his supporters to use nonviolent protest to gain equal rights. So, people that were for civil rights for African Americans, he said, don't fight or hurt people. Do something that you can make a change without doing that. His speeches moved many to action and drew attention to racial discrimination that affected African Americans. A new civil rights law was passed in August 1957. This law made it illegal to use force to stop someone from voting. This was the first civil rights law since Reconstruction. Progress was continually challenged. The governor of Arkansas tried to prevent 9 African American children from attending an all white school in Little Rock. The state's National Guard was ordered to protect the school. A National Guard is a state's military force. President Eisenhower sent federal troops to help the African American children. The governor finally backed down. It happened in history. Martin Luther King Jr. gave one of his most famous speeches called I Have a Dream in 1963. This speech is considered to be a cornerstone of the civil rights movement. It can be found there. What was life like in the 1950s? Again, automation means the use of machines to do work. American society experienced many changes in the 1950s. Jobs were available for most Americans. With the development of automation, factories employed thousands of people to produce countless new products. Advances in science and technology offered Americans better health and a higher standard of living than ever before. The family and the home became popular symbols of American life. The image of women as housewives and husbands as breadwinners were commonly found in magazine advertising and TV commercials. In the late 1950s, many middle-class families had both husbands and wives working outside the home. Most women did not hold career jobs like their husbands. In general, jobs held by married women were seen as temporary until children arrived. But unlike their mothers, many women thought that being a homemaker or a temporary employee was not their only choice. Women began to question the narrow role assigned to them in society. Early in the 1960s, the first steps of the women's movement were taken. The purpose of the women's movement was to seek social and economic equality for American women. Most television programs were black and white in the 1950s. You can see the picture of them watching TV. In 1956, the federal government, so that means the national government, the U.S. government, started a huge program to build interstate highways. So that's highways that go across states. The highways would connect most cities with populations over 50,000. As the roads were built, suburbs attracted more home builders. New cars had large fins on their rear fenders. Some young people drove hot rods or cars that had been adjusted to go faster. Crew cuts were a common hairstyle for boys. Girls wore their hair in ponytails. Television was only black and white. Young children watched a puppet named Howdy Doody and his friend Buffalo Bob. Rock and roll music was new and young people loved it. The term UFO, unidentified flying object, entered the vocabulary of many Americans. Geography note, up on the top left. In 1959, Alaska and Hawaii joined the United States. They were the first states added to the nation since the admission of Arizona in 1912. Alaska was the 49th state, Hawaii was the 50th. How was Eisenhower reelected? In the election of 1956, Eisenhower was elected by an even greater landslide than in the previous election. Democrats, however, took control of Congress. So that's our lawmaking body. Although many Republicans considered the president to be too liberal, Americans seemed to be happy with him. Biography. Margaret Chase Smith, 1897 to 1995. A Republican from Maine, Margaret Chase Smith was the first woman elected to each of the houses of Congress. She completed her husband's term in the House of Representatives after his death in 1940. Then Smith was elected to 4 more 2-year terms. She next served in the Senate for 25 years, longer than any other woman. During the early 1950s, she spoke out against the methods of Senator Joseph McCarthy. In 1964, Smith campaigned for the Republican presidential nomination. She was the first woman ever to campaign for the presidential nomination in a major party. Smith wrote the book Gallant Women in 1968. The book documented the lives of independent women in American public life. Artificial satellite, again, human object made by humans that travels in outer space and sends signals back to Earth. How did the space race begin? The United States was taken by surprise when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik on October 4th, 1957. Sputnik was an artificial satellite to travel in outer space and sent radio signals back to Earth. Everyone was concerned that a foreign country knew how to do something that the Americans did not. The United States was developing space technology, but the Russians raced ahead. Sputnik 2, carrying a dog, was launched before the United States could get into space. A new battle had been added to the Cold War. Remember, the Cold War is a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union wanted to spread communism. The United States wanted to stop communism or spread democracy. On January 31st, 1958, the U.S. Army put the first American satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit. This was 3 months after the launch of Sputnik 2. The following October, the United States created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. All right, as you do these questions, how did Americans prepare for a nuclear war? What was McCarthyism? How did Rosa Parks help begin the civil rights movement? How did roads improve in the 1950s? How did the Russians start the space race? I will help you a little bit with this maybe question. What do you think? Do you think you would have liked living in the 1950s? Why or why not? So think about what their jobs were, what men's jobs were, what kind of entertainment they had, what kind of things were on TV, what kinds of things were going on in politics, whether it's segregation or civil rights, to make your answer. So maybe you'd say, I would have not have liked living in the 1950s. One reason is the fact that women were oppressed, and so were African Americans. This is a major portion of our society, and they should have equal rights with any other person. I also think that women and men should have the same kinds of jobs, and I don't think that it's fair that society said women should stay home and take care of the children. Okay, something like that. Okay, so that's what you got for today, and that's it.